Chapter 17 of The Amazing Interlude by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This LibriVox is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. There was a question to settle, and it was for Henri to do it. Two questions, indeed. One was a matter of engineering, and before the bottom fell out of his world Henri had studied engineering. The second was more serious. For the first, this thing had happened. Of all the trenches to be held, the Belgians had undeniably the worst. Properly speaking, they were not trenches at all, but shallow gutters dug a foot or two into the saturated ground, and then built man-high with bags of earth or sand. Here and there they were not dug at all, but were purely shelters, against a railway embankment, of planks or sandbags, and reinforced by rails from the deserted track behind which they were hidden. For this corner of Belgium had been saved by turning it into a shallow lake. By opening the gates in the dikes, the Allies had let in the sea and placed a flood in front of the advancing enemy. The battle front was a reeking pond. The opposing armies lived like duck hunters in a swamp. To dig a foot was to encounter water. Machine guns here and there sat but 6 inches above the yellow flood. Men lay in pools to fire them. To reach outposts were narrow paths built first of bags of earth, a life sometimes for every bag. And when this filling was sufficient, on top a path of fascines, bound together in bundles, made a footway. For this reason the Belgians approached their trenches not through deep cuts which gave them shelter, but with no other cover than the darkness of night. During the day they lay in their shallow dugouts, cut off from any connection with the world behind them. Food, cooked miles away, came up at night, cold and unappetizing. For water, having exhausted their canteens, there was nothing but the brackish tide before them, ill-smelling and reeking of fever. Water carts trundled forward at night, but often they were far too few. The Belgians, having faced their future through long years of anxiety, had been trained to fight. In a way they had been trained to fight a losing war, for they could not hope to defeat their greedy neighbor to the east. But now they found themselves fighting almost not at all, condemned to inactivity, to being almost passively slaughtered by enemy artillery, and to living under such conditions as would have sapped the courage of a less desperate people. To add to the difficulties, not only did the sea encroach, turning a fertile land into a salt marsh, but the winter rains, unusually heavy that tragic first winter, and lacking their usual egress to the sea, spread the flood. There were many places well back of the lines, where fields were flooded, and where roads, sadly needed, lost themselves in unfordable wallows of mud and water. Henri then, knowing all this, none better, had his first question to settle, which was this. As spring advanced the flood had commenced to recede. Time came when, in those trenches now huddled shallow behind the railway track, one could live in certain comfort. In the deeper ones the bottom of the trench appeared for the first time. On a day previous, however, the water had commenced to come back. There had been no rain, but little by little in a certain place yellow, ill-smelling little streams began to flow sluggishly into the trenches. Seeped rather than flowed. At first the Belgian officers laid it to the bad luck that had so persistently pursued them. Then they held a conference in the small brick house with its maps and pine tables and its picture of an American harvester on the wall, which was now headquarters. Sitting under the hanging lamp, with an orderly making coffee at a stove in the corner, they talked it over. Henri was there, silent before his elders, but intently listening. And at last they turned to him. "I can go and find out," he said quietly. "It is possible, though I do not see how." He smiled. "They are, I think, only drying themselves at our expense. It is a bit of German humor." But the cry of "Calais in a month" was in the air, and undoubtedly there had been renewed activity along the German front near the sea. The second question to be answered was dependent on the first. Had the Germans, as Henri said, merely shifted the water, by some clever engineering, to the Belgian trenches, or was there some bigger thing on hand? What, for instance, if they were about to attempt to drain the inundation, smash the Belgian line, and march by the Dunkirk road to Calais? So that night, when Henri jested about Pierre's right elbow and watched Sara Lee for a smile, he had difficult work before him. Some time near midnight he slipped away. Jean was waiting in the street, and wrung the boy's hand. "I could go with you," he said rather wistfully. You don't speak their ugly tongue. I could be mute, shell-shock. You could be helping me back." But Henri only held his hand for a moment and shook his head. "You would double the risk, and what good would it do? 2 pistols are better than 1." "I have 2 pistols, my friend," said Henri, and turned the corner of the building, past the boards René had built in, and toward the house of the mill. But once out of Jean's sight he stopped a moment, his hand resting against that frail wall to Sara Lee's room. It was his good-bye to her. For 3 days Jean stayed in the village. He slept at the mill, but he came for his meals to the little house. Once he went to Dunkirk and brought out provisions and the mail, including Sara Lee's monthly allowance. But mostly he sat in the mill house and waited. He could not read. "You do not eat at all, Jean," Sara Lee said to him more than once. And twice she insisted that he was feverish and placed a hand that was somewhat marred with the peelings of vegetables on his forehead. "I am entirely well, mademoiselle," he would say, and draw back. He had anxieties enough just now without being reminded by the touch of a woman's hand of all that he had lost. Long before that Sara Lee had learned not to question Jean about Henri's absences. Even his knowledge, now that she knew something of Henri's work, did not remove the barrier. So Sara Lee waited, as did Jean, but more helplessly. She knew something was wrong, but she had not Jean's privilege of going at night to the trenches and there waiting, staring over the gray water with its ugly floating shadows, for Henri to emerge from the flood. Something rather forced and mechanical there was those days in her work. Her smile was rather set. She did not sleep well. And one night she violated Henri's orders and walked across the softened fields to beyond the poplar trees. There was nothing to see except an intermittent flash from the clouds that hung low over the sea at Nieuport, where British gunboats were bombarding the coast, or the steady streaks from Ypres salient, where night and day the guns never rested. From the Belgian trenches, 1,500 feet or so away, there was no sound. A German electric signal blazed its message in code and went out quickly. Now and then a rifle shot, thin and sharp, rang out from where, under the floating starlights, keen eyes on each side watched for movements on the other. Sara Lee sat down under a tree and watched for a while. Then she found herself crying softly. It was all so sad and useless and cruel. And somewhere there ahead was Henri. Henri with his blue eyes, his smile, the ardor of his young arms. Henri, who had been to her many friends. Sara Lee had never deceived herself about Henri. She loved him, but she was quite certain she was not in love with him, which is entirely different. She knew that this last was impossible, because she was engaged to Harvey. What was probably the truth was that she loved them both in entirely different ways. Men have always insisted on such possibilities, and have even asserted their right, now and then, to love 2 women at the same time. But women are less frank with themselves. And, in such cases, there is no grand passion. There are tenderness, and the joy of companionship, and sometimes a touching dependence. But it is not a love that burns with a white fire. Perhaps Sara Lee was one of those women who are always loved more than they love. There are such women, not selfish, not seeking love, but softly feminine, kind, appealing, and genuine. Men need, after all, but an altar on which to lay tribute. And the high, remote white altar that was Sara Lee had already received the love of 2 strong men. She was not troubling her head that night, however, about being an altar, of a sort. She cried a little at first, because she was terrified for Henri, and because Jean's face was growing pinched and gray. Then she cried very hard, prone on the ground and face down, because Henri was young, and all of life should have been before him, and he was missing. Henri was undeniably missing. Even the King knew it now, and set down in his heart among the other crosses there Henri's full name, which we may not know, and took to pacing his little study and looking out at the spring sea. That night Marie, having ladled to the bottom of her kettle, found Sara Lee missing, and was told by René of the direction she had taken. Marie, muttering to herself, set out to find her, and almost stumbled over her in the wood by the road. She sat down on the ground without a word and placed a clumsy hand on the girl's shoulder. It was not until Sara Lee ceased sobbing that she spoke. "It is far from hopeless, mademoiselle." They had by now established a system of communication. Sara Lee spoke her orders in halting French, but general conversation was beyond her. And much hearing of English had taught the Belgian girl enough to follow. Sara Lee replied then, in smothered English, "He's gone, Marie. He will never come back." "Who can tell? There are many missing who are not dead." Sara Lee shuddered. For spies were not made prisoners. They had no rights as prisoners of war. Their own governments did not protect them. To Henri, capture was death. But she could not say this to Marie. Marie sat softly stroking Sara Lee's hair, her own eyes tragic and tearless. "Even if it were the other," she said, "it is not so bad to die for one's country. The thing that is terrible, that leaves behind it only bitterness and grief, and no hope, mademoiselle, even with many prayers, is that one has died a traitor." She coaxed Sara Lee back at last. They went through the fields, for fresh troops were being thrown into the Belgian trenches and the street was full of men. Gray dray horses were dragging forward batteries, heavy guns sliding and slipping. In the absence of such information as only Henri had been wont to bring, it was best to provide for the worst. The next day Jean did not come over for breakfast, and René handed Sara Lee a note. "I'm going to England," Jean had written that dawn in the house of the mill, "and from there to Holland. I can get past the barrier and shall work down toward the front. I must learn what has happened, mademoiselle. As you know, if he was captured, there is no hope. But there is an excellent chance that he is in hiding, unable to get back. Look for me in 2 weeks." There followed what instructions he had given as to her supplies, which would come as before. Beautifully written in Jean's small fine hand, it spelled for Sara Lee the last hope. She read Jean's desperation through its forced cheerfulness, and she faced for the first time a long period of loneliness in the crowded little house. She tried very hard to fill the gap that Henri had left, tried to joke with the men in her queer bits of French, was more smiling than ever, for fear she might be less. But now and then in cautious whispers she heard Henri's name, and her heart contracted with very terror. A week. 2 weeks. Twice the village was bombarded severely, but the little house escaped by a miracle. Marie considered it the same miracle that left holy pictures unhurt on the walls of destroyed houses, and allowed the frailest of old ebony and rosewood crucifixes to remain unharmed. Great generals, often as tall as they were great, stopped at the little house to implore Sara Lee to leave, but she only shook her head. "Not unless you send me away," she always said, "and that would break my heart." "But to move, mademoiselle, only to the next village," they would remonstrate, and as a final argument, "You are too valuable to risk an injury." "I must remain here," she said, and some of them thought they understood. When an unusually obdurate officer came along, Sara Lee would insist on taking him to the cellar. "You see," she would say, holding her candle high, "it is a nice cellar, warm and dry. It is," proudly, "one of the best cellars in the village. It is a really homelike cellar." The officer would go away then and send her cigarettes for her men or, as in more than one case, a squad with bags of earth and other things to protect the little house as much as possible. After a time the little house began to represent the ideas in protection and camouflage, then in its early stages, of many different minds. René shot a man there one night, a skulking figure working its way in the shadows of the street. It was just before dawn, and René, who was sleepless those days, like others, called to him. The man started to run, dodging behind walls. But René ran faster and killed him. He was a German, in Belgian peasant's clothing. He wore the great shoes of the German soldier, and he had been making a rough map of the Belgian trenches. Sara Lee did not see him. But when she heard the shot she went out, and René told her breathlessly. From that time on her terrors took the definite form of Henri lying dead in a ruined street, and being buried, as this man was buried, without ceremony and without a prayer, in some sodden spring field. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Amazing Interlude by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. As the spring advanced, Harvey grew increasingly bitter, grew morbid and increasingly self-conscious also. He began to think that people were smiling behind his back, and when they asked about Sara Lee he met with almost insulting brevity what he felt was half contemptuous kindness. He went nowhere, worked all day and until late into the night. He did well in his business, however, and late in March he received a substantial raise in salary. He took it without enthusiasm, and told Belle that night at dinner with apathy. After the evening meal it was now his custom to go to his room and there, shut in, to read. He read no books on the war, and even the quarter column entitled Salient Points of the Day's War News hardly received a glance from him now. In the office when the talk turned to the war, as it did almost hourly, he would go out or scowl over his letters. "Harvey's hit hard," they said there. "He's acting like a rotten cub," was likely to be the next sentence. But sometimes it was, "Well, what do you expect? Everything ready to get married, and the girl beating it to France without notice. I'd be sore myself." On the day of the raise in salary, his sister got the children to bed and straightened up the litter of small garments that seemed always to bestrew the house, even to the lower floor. Then she went into Harvey's room. Coat and collar off, he was lying on the bed but not reading. His book lay beside him, and with his arms under his head he was staring at the ceiling. She did not sit down beside him on the bed. They were an undemonstrative family, and such endearments as Belle used were lavished on her children. But her eyes were kind, and a little nervous. "Do you mind talking a little, Harvey?" "I don't feel like talking much. I'm tired, I guess. But go on. What is it? Bills?" She came to him in her constant financial anxieties, and always he was ready to help her out. But his tone was now gruff. A slight flush of resentment colored her cheeks. "Not this time, Harv. I was just thinking about things." "Sit down." She sat on the straight chair beside the bed, the chair on which, in neat order, Harvey placed his clothing at night, his shoes beneath, his coat over the back. "I wish you'd go out more, Harvey." "Why? Go out and talk to a lot of driveling fools who don't care for me any more than I do for them?" "That's not like you, Harv." "Sorry." His tone softened. "I don't care much about going round, Belle. That's all. I guess you know why." "So does everybody else." He sat up and looked at her. "Well, suppose they do. I can't help that, can I? When a fellow has been jilted—" "You haven't been jilted." He lay down again, his arms under his head, and Belle knew that his eyes were on Sara Lee's picture on the dresser. "It amounts to the same thing." "Harvey," Belle said, hesitatingly, "I've brought Sara Lee's report from the Ladies' Aid. May I read it to you?" "I don't want to hear it." "Then, give it here. I'll look at it." He read it carefully, his hands rather unsteady. So many men given soup, so many given chocolate, so many dressings done, and at the bottom Sara Lee's request for more money. An apologetic, rather breathless request, and closing rather primly with this: "I am sure that the society will feel, from the above report, that the work is worth while and worth continuing. I am only sorry that I cannot send photographs of the men who come for aid, but as they come at night, it is impossible. I enclose, however, a small picture of the house, which is now known as the Little House of Mercy." "At night?" said Harvey. "So she's there alone with a lot of ignorant foreigners at night? Why the devil don't they come in the daytime?" "Here's the picture, Harvey." He got up then and carried the tiny photograph over close to the gas jet. There he stood for a long time, gazing at it. There was René with his rifle and his smile. There was Marie in her white apron. And in the center, the wind blowing her soft hair, was Sara Lee. Harvey groaned, and Belle came over, and putting her hand on his shoulder, looked at the photograph with him. "Do you know what I think, Harvey?" she said. "I think Sara Lee is right, and you are wrong." He turned on her almost savagely. "That's not the point," he snapped out. "I don't begrudge the poor devils their soup. What I feel is this. If she'd cared a tinker's damn for me, she'd never have gone. That's all." He returned to a moody survey of the picture. "Look at it," he said. "She insists that she's safe. But that fellow's got a gun. What for, if she's so safe? And look at that house. There's a corner shot away, and it's got no upper floor. Safe!" Belle held out her hand. "I must return the picture to the society, Harve." "Not just yet," he said ominously. "I want to look at it. I haven't got it all yet. And I'll return it myself, with a short speech." "Harvey!" "Well?" he retorted. "Why shouldn't I tell that lot of old scandalmongers what I think of them? They'll sit here safe at home and beg money. God, one of them was in the office today. And send a young girl over to You'd better get out, Belle. I'm not company for anyone tonight." She turned away, but he came after her, and suddenly putting his arms round her, he kissed her. "Don't worry about me," he said. "I'm done with wearing my heart on my sleeve. She looks happy, so I guess I can be." He released her. "Good night. I'll return the picture." He sat up very late, alternately reading the report and looking at the picture. It was unfortunate that Sara Lee had smiled into the camera. Coupled with her blowing hair it had given her a light-heartedness, a sort of joyousness, that hurt him to the soul. He made some mad plans after he had turned out the lights, to flirt wildly with the unattached girls he knew, to go to France and confront Sara Lee and then bring her home, or He had found a way. He lay there and thought it over, and it bore the test of the broken sleep that followed. In the morning, dressing, he wondered he had not thought of it before. He was more cheerful at breakfast than he had been for weeks. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Amazing Interlude by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. In the little house of mercy 2 weeks went by, and then a third. Soldiers marching out to the trenches sometimes wore flowers tucked gaily in their caps. More and more Allied aeroplanes were in the air. Sometimes, standing in the streets, Sara Lee saw one far overhead, while balloon-shaped clouds of bursting shells hung far below it. Once or twice in the early morning a German plane, flying so low that one could easily see the black cross on each wing, reconnoitered the village for wagon trains or troops. Always they found it empty. Hope had almost fled now. In the afternoons Marie went to the ruined church and there knelt before the heap of marble and masonry that had once been the altar, and prayed. And Sara Lee, who had been brought up a Protestant and had never before entered a Catholic church, took to going there too. In some strange fashion the peace of former days seemed to cling to the little structure, roofless as it was. On quiet days its silence was deeper than elsewhere. On days of much firing the sound from within its broken walls seemed deadened, far away. Marie burned a candle as she prayed, for that soul in purgatory which she had once loved and now pitied. Sara Lee burned no candle, but she knelt, sometimes beside Marie, sometimes alone, and prayed for many things. That Henri should be living, somewhere. That the war might end. That day there would be little wounding. That some day the Belgians might go home again. And that back in America Harvey might grow to understand and forgive her. And now and then she looked into the very depths of her soul, and on those days she prayed that her homeland might, before it was too late, see this thing as she was seeing it. The wanton waste of it all, the ghastly cruelty the Germans had brought into this war. Sara Lee's vague thinking began to crystallize. This war was not a judgment sent from on high to a sinful world. It was the wicked imposition of one nation on other nations. It was national. It was almost racial. But most of all it was a war of hate on the German side. She had never believed in hate. There were ugly passions in the world, jealousy, envy, suspicion, but not hate. The word was not in her rather limited vocabulary. There was no hate on the part of the men she knew. The officers who stopped in on their way to and from the trenches were gentlemen and soldiers. They were determined and grave. They resented, they even loathed, but they did not hate. The little Belgian soldiers were bewildered, puzzled, desperately resentful, but of hate, as translated into terms of frightfulness, they had no understanding. Yet from the other side were coming methods of war so wantonly cruel, so useless save as inflicting needless agony, as only hate could devise. No strategic value justified them. They were spontaneous outgrowths of venom, nursed during the winter deadlock and now grown to full size and destructive power. The rumor of a gas that seared and killed came to the little house as early as February. In March there came the first victims, poor writhing creatures, deprived of the boon of air, their seared lungs collapsed and agonized, their faces drawn into masks of suffering. Some of them died in the little house, and even after death their faces held the imprint of horror. To Sara Lee, burying her own anxiety under the cloak of service, there came new and terrible thoughts. This was not war. The Germans had sent their clouds of poisoned gas across the inundation, but had made no attempt to follow. This was killing, for the lust of killing, suffering, for the joy of inflicting pain. And a day or so later she heard of the Hague Convention. She had not known of it before. Now she learned of that gentleman's agreement among nations, and that it said, "The use of poison or of poisoned weapons is forbidden." She pondered that carefully, trying to think dispassionately. Now and then she received a copy of a home newspaper, and she saw that the use of poison gases was being denied by Germans in America and set down to rumor and hysteria. So, on a cold spring day, she sat down at the table in the salle à manger and wrote a letter to the President, beginning, "Dear Sir," and telling what she knew of poison gas. She also, on second thought, wrote to one Andrew Carnegie, who had built a library in her city. She felt that the expense to him of sending someone over to investigate would not be prohibitive, and something must be done. She never heard from either of her letters, but she felt better for having written them. And a day or two later she received from Mrs. Travers, in England, a small supply of the first gas masks of the war. Simple and primitive they were, those first masks. Useless, too, as it turned out. A square of folded gauze soaked in some solution and then dried, with tapes to tie it over the mouth and nose. To adjust them the soldiers had but to stoop and wet them in the ever-present water in the trench, and then to tie them on. Sara Lee gave them out that night, and there was much mirth in the little house, such mirth as there had not been since Henri went away. The Belgians called it a bal masque, and putting them on bowed before one another and requested dances, and even flirted coyly with each other over their bits of white gauze. And in the very middle of the gaiety someone propounded one of Henri's idiotic riddles, and Sara Lee went across to her little room and closed the door and stood there with her eyes shut, for fear she would scream. Then, one day, coming out of the little church, she saw the low broken gray car turn in at the top of the street and come slowly, so very slowly, toward her. There were 2 men in it. One was Henri. She ran, stumbling because of tears, up this street. It was Henri. There was no mistake. There he sat beside Jean, brushed and very neat, and very, very white. "Mademoiselle," he said, and came very close to crying himself when he saw her face. He was greatly excited. His sunken eyes devoured her as she ran toward him. Almost he held out his arms, but he could not do that, even if he would, for one was bandaged to his side. It was rather sad to record how many times Sara Lee wept during her amazing interlude, for here is another time. She wept for joy and wretchedness. She stood on the running board and cried and smiled, and Jean winked his one eye rapidly. "This idiot, mademoiselle," he said gruffly. "This maniac. He would not remain in Calais with proper care. He must come here, and rapidly. Could he have taken the wheel from me we should have been here an hour ago. But for once I have an advantage." The car jolted to the little house, and Jean helped Henri out. Such a strange Henri, smiling and joyous, and walking at a crawl, even with Jean's support. He protested violently against being put to bed, and when he found himself led into Sara Lee's small room he openly rebelled. "Never!" he said stubbornly, halting at the doorway. "This is Mademoiselle's boudoir. Her drawing-room as well. I'm going to the mill house and—" He staggered. So Sara Lee's room had a different occupant for a time, a thin and fine-worn young Belgian, who yielded to Sara Lee when Jean gave up in despair, and who proceeded, most unmanfully, to faint as soon as he was between the blankets. If Sara Lee hoped to nurse Henri she was doomed to disappointment. Jean it was who took over the care of the boy, a Jean who now ate prodigiously and whistled occasionally and slept at night robed in his blanket on the floor beside Henri's bed, lest that rebellious invalid get up and try to move about. On the first night, with the door closed, against Henri's entreaties, while the little house received its evening complement of men, and with Henri lying back on his pillows, fresh dressed as to the wounds in his arm and chest, fed with Sara Lee's daintiest, and resting, Jean found the boy's eyes resting on the mantel. "Dear and obstinate friend," said Henri, "do you wish me to be happy?" "You shall not leave the room or your bed. That is arranged for." "How?" demanded Henri with interest. "Because I have hidden away your trousers." Henri laughed, but he sobered quickly. "If you wish me to be happy," he said, "take away that American photograph. But first, please bring it here." Jean brought it, holding it gingerly between his thumb and forefinger, and Henri laid back and studied it. "It is mademoiselle's fiancé," he said. "Humph!" Jean grunted. "Look at it, Jean," Henri said in his half bantering tone, with despair beneath it. "And then look at me. Or no, remembering me as I was when I was a man. Is he better? Eh? It is a good face. But there is a jaw, and... Do you think he will be kind to her as she requires? She requires much kindness. Some women—" He broke off and watched Jean anxiously. "A half face," Jean said scornfully. "The pretty view. As for kindness—" He put the photograph down on the table. "I knew once a man in Belgium who married an American. At Antwerp. They were most unhappy." Henri smiled. "You are lying," he said with boyish pleasure in his own astuteness. "You knew no such couple. You are trying to make me resigned." But quite a while later, when Jean thought he was asleep, he said, "I shall never be resigned." So at last spring had come, and Henri and the great spring drive. The Germans had not drained the inundation, nor had they broken through at Calais, and it is not to be known here how much this utter failure had been due to the information Henri had secured before he was wounded. One day in his bed Henri received a visit from the King, and was left lying with a decoration on his breast, and a beatific, if somewhat sheepish, expression on his face. And one night the village was bombarded, and on Henri's refusing to be moved to the cellar, Sara Lee took up a determined stand in his doorway, until at last he made a most humiliating move for safety. Bit by bit Sara Lee got the story, its bare detail from Henri, its courage and sheer recklessness from Jean. It would, for instance, run like this, with Henri in a chair perhaps and cutting dressings, since that might be done with one hand, and Sara Lee, sleeves rolled up in a great bowl of vegetables before her. "And when you went through the water, Henri," she would ask, "what then?" "It was quite simple. They had put up some additional wire, however—" "Where?" "There was a break," he would explain. "I've told you, between their trenches. I had used it before to get through." "But how could you get through?" "Like a snake," he would say, smiling. "Very flat and wriggling. I have eaten of the dirt, mademoiselle." Then he would stop and cut very awkwardly with his left hand. "Go on," she would prompt him. "But they had put barbed wire there. Is that it? So you could not get through?" "With tin cans on it, and stones in the cans. I thought I had removed them all, but there was one left. So they heard me." More cutting and a muttered French expletive. Henri was not a particularly patient cripple. And apparently there was an end to the story. "For goodness' sake!" Sara Lee would exclaim despairingly. "So they heard you. That isn't all, is it?" "It was almost all," he would say with his boyish smile. "And they shot at you?" "Even better. They shot me. That was this one," and he would point to his arm. More silence, more cutting, a gathering exasperation on Sara Lee's part. "Are you going on or not?" "Then I pretended to be one of them, mademoiselle. I speak German as French. I pretended not to be hurt, but to be on a reconnaissance, and I got into the trench and we had a talk in the darkness. It was most interesting. Only if they had shown a light they would have seen that I was wounded." By bits, not that day, but after many days, she got the story. In the next trench he slipped a sling over the wounded area, and, as a Bavarian on his way to the dressing station, got back. "I had some trouble," he confessed one day. "Now and then one would offer to go back with me, and I did not care for assistance." But some time later there was trouble. She was 4 days getting to that part of it. He had got behind the lines by that time, and knew that in some way suspicion had been roused. He was weak by that time, and could not go far. He had lain hidden, for a day and part of a night, without water, in a destroyed barn, and then had escaped. He got into the Belgian costume as before, but he could not wear a sling for his wounded arm. He got the peasant to thrust his helpless right hand into his pocket, and for 2 days he made a close inspection of what was going on. But fever had developed, and on the 3rd night, half delirious, when he was spoken to by an officer, he had replied, of all tongues, in English. The officer shot him instantly in the chest. He fell and lay still, and the officer bent over him. In that moment Henri stabbed him with a knife in his left hand. Men were coming from every direction, but he got away. He did not clearly remember how. And at dawn he fell into the Belgian farmhouse, apparently dying. Jean's story, on the other hand, was given early and with no hesitation. He had crossed the border at Holland in civilian clothes, by the simple expedient of bribing a sentry. He had got, with little difficulty, to the farmhouse and found Henri, now recovering but very weak. He was lying hidden in a garret, and he was suffering from hunger and a lack of medical attention. In a wagon full of market stuff, Henri hidden in the bed of it, they had got to the border again. And there Jean had, it seemed, stabbed the sentry he had bribed before, and driven on to neutral soil. Not an unusual story, that of Henri and Jean. The journey across Belgium in the springless farm wagon was the worst. They had to take roundabout lanes, avoiding the main highways. Fortunately, always at night there were friendly houses, kind hands to lift Henri to the warm fire-lighted interiors. Many messages they had brought back, some of cheer, but too often of tragedy, from the small farmsteads of Belgium. Then finally had been Holland, and the chartering of a boat, and at last, "Here we are, and here we are, and here we are again," sang Henri, chopping at his cotton and making a great show of cheerfulness before Sara Lee. But with Jean sometimes he showed the black depression beneath. He would never be a man again. He was done for. He gained strength so slowly that he believed he was not gaining at all. He was not happy, and the unhappy mend slowly. After the time he had asked Jean to take away Harvey's photograph, he did not recur to the subject, but he did not need to. Jean knew, perhaps even better than Henri himself, that the boy was recklessly, hopelessly, not quite rationally in love with the American girl. Also Henri was fretting about his work. Sometimes at night, following Henri's instructions, Jean wandered quietly along roads and paths that paralleled the front. At such times his eyes were turned, not toward the trenches, but toward that flat country which lay behind, still dotted at that time with groves of trees, with canals overhung with pollard willows, and here and there a farmhouse that at night took on in the starlight the appearance of being whole again. Singularly white and peaceful were those small steadings of Belgium in the night hours, until cruel dawn showed them for what they were, skeletons of dead homes, clothed only at night with wraith-like roofs and chimneys. Ghosts of houses, appearing between midnight and cock-crow. Jean had not Henri's eyes, nor his recklessness, nor his speed, for that matter. Now and then he saw the small appearing and disappearing of lights on some small rise. He would reach the spot, with such shelter as possible, only to find a sugar-beet field, neglected and unplowed. Then, one night, tragedy came to the little house of mercy. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Amazing Interlude by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. Harvey proceeded to put his plan into effect at once, with the simple method of an essentially simple nature. The thing had become intolerable, therefore it must end. On the afternoon following his talk with Belle, he came home at 3 o'clock. Belle heard him moving about in his room, and when she entered it, after he had gone, she found that he had shaved and put on his best suit. She smiled a little. It was like Harvey to be literal. He had said he was going to go round and have a good time, and he was losing no time. But in their restricted social life, where most of the men worked until 5 o'clock or even later, there were few afternoon calls paid. Belle wondered with mild sisterly curiosity into what arena Harvey was about to fling his best hat. But though Harvey paid a call that afternoon, it was not on any of the young women he knew. He went to see Mrs. Gregory. She was at home. He had arranged for that by telephone, and the one butler of the neighborhood admitted him. It was a truculent young man, for all his politeness, who confronted Mrs. Gregory in her drawing-room. A quietly truculent young man, who came to the point while he was still shaking hands. "You're not going to be glad to see me in a minute," he said, replying to her greeting. "But how can you know that?" "Because I've come to get you to do something you won't want to do." "We won't quarrel before we begin, then," she said pleasantly, "because I really never do anything I don't wish to do." But she gave him a second glance, and her smile became a trifle forced. She knew all about Harvey and Sara Lee. She had heard rumors of his disapproval also. Though she was not a clever nor a very keen woman, she saw what was coming and braced herself for it. Harvey had prepared in his mind a summary of his position, and he delivered it with the rapidity and strength of a blow. "I know all about the Belgians, Mrs. Gregory," he said. "I'm sorry for them. So is everyone, I suppose. But I want to know if you think a girl of 20 ought to be over there practically at the front, and alone." He gave her time to reply. "Would you like to have one of your daughters there, if you had one?" "Perhaps not, under ordinary circumstances. But this is war." "It is not our war." "Humanity," said Mrs. Gregory, remembering the phrase she had written for a speech. "Humanity has no nationality. It's of all men, for all men." "That's men, not women." He got up and stood on the hearthrug. He was singularly reminiscent of the time he had stood on Aunt Harriet's white fur rug and had told Sara Lee she could not go. "Now see here, Mrs. Gregory," he said. "We'll stop beating about the bush, if you don't mind. She's got to come home. She's coming, if I have to go and get her." "You needn't look at me so fiercely. I didn't send her. It was her own idea." Harvey sneered. "No," he said. "But I notice your society publishes her reports in the papers, and that the names of the officers are rarely missing." Mrs. Gregory colored. "We must have publicity to get money," she said. "It is hard to get. Sometimes I have to make up the deficit out of my own pocket." "Then for God's sake bring her home. If the thing has to go on, send over there some of the middle-aged women who have no ties. Let 'em get shot at if they want to. They can write as good reports as she can, if that's all you want. And make as good soup," he added bitterly. "It could be done, of course," she said thoughtfully. "But I must tell you this. I doubt if an older woman could have got where she has. There is no doubt that her charm, her youth and beauty have helped her greatly. We cannot—" The very whites of his eyes turned red then. He shouted furiously that for their silly work and their love of publicity they were trading on a young girl's youth and beauty. That if anything happened to her he would publish the truth in every newspaper in the country. That they would at once recall Sara Lee, or he would placard the city with what they were doing. These were only a few of the things he threw at her. When he was out of breath he jerked the picture of the little house of mercy out of his pocket and flung it into her lap. "There," he said. "Do you know where that house is? It's in a ruined village. She hasn't said that, has she? Well, look at the masonry there. That's a shell hole in the street. That soldier's got a gun. Why? Because the Germans may march up that street any day on their way to Calais." Mrs. Gregory looked at the picture. Sara Lee smiled into the sun. And René, ignorant that his single rifle was to oppose the march of the German army to Calais, René smiled also. Mrs. Gregory rose. "I shall report your view to the society," she said coldly. "I understand how you feel, but I fail to see the reason for this attack on me." "I guess you see all right," he flung at her. "She's my future wife. If you hadn't put this nonsense into her head we'd be married by now, and she'd be here in God's country, and not living with a lot of foreigners who don't know a good woman when they see one. I want her back, that's all. But I want her back safe. If anything happens to her, I'll make you pay. You and all your notoriety hunters." He went out then, and was for leaving without his hat or coat, but the butler caught him at the door. Out in the spring sunlight he walked rapidly, still seething, remembering other bitter things he had meant to say, and repeating them to himself. But he had said enough. Mrs. Gregory's account of his visit she reported at a meeting specially called. The narrative lost nothing in the repetition, but the kindly women who sat in the church house sewing or knitting listened to what Harvey had said and looked troubled. They liked Sara Lee, and many of them had daughters of their own. The photograph was passed around. Undoubtedly Sara Lee was living in a ruined village. Certainly ruined villages were only found very near the front. And René unquestionably held a gun. Tales of German brutalities to women had come and were coming constantly to their ears. Mabel Andrews had written to them for supplies, and she had added to the chapter of horrors. Briefly, the sense of the meeting was that Harvey had been brutal, but that he was right. An older woman in a safe place they might continue to support, but none of them would assume the responsibility of the crushing out of a young girl's life. To be quite frank, possibly Harvey's appeal would have carried less weight had it not coincided with Sara Lee's request for more money. Neither one alone would have brought about the catastrophe, but all together they made question and answer, problem and solution. Money was scarce, demands were heavy. None of them except Mrs. Gregory had more than just enough, and there was this additional situation to face. There was no end to the war in sight. It gave promise now of going on indefinitely. Joffre had said, "I nibble them." But to nibble a hole in the German army might take years. They had sent Sara Lee for a few months. How about keeping her there indefinitely? Oddly enough, it was Harvey's sister Belle who made the only protest against the recall. "Of course, I want her back," she said slowly. "You'd understand better if you had to live with Harvey. I'm sorry, Mrs. Gregory, that he spoke to you as he did, but he's nearly crazy." She eyed the assembly with her tired, shrewd eyes. "I'm no talker," she went on, "but Sara Lee has done a big thing. We don't realize, I guess, how big it is, and I think we'll just about kill her if we bring her home." "Better to do that than to have her killed over there," someone said. And in spite of Belle's protest, that remained the sense of the meeting. It was put to the vote and decided to recall Sara Lee. She could bring a report of conditions, and if she thought it wise an older woman could go later, to a safer place. Belle was very quiet that evening. After dinner she went to Harvey's room and found him dressing to go out. "I'm going with a crowd to the theater," he said. "First week of the summer stock company, you know." He tied his tie defiantly, avoiding Belle's eyes in the mirror. "Harvey," she said, "they're going to bring Sara Lee home." He said nothing, but his hand shook somewhat. "And I think," Belle said, "that you will be sorry for what you have done, all the rest of your life." End of chapter 20.